Have you ever wondered why the world feels like it's getting worse, despite the fact that when you look at all of the relevant and profound metrics, it's clearly getting better? So in this video, we're going to be looking at all the ways in which the world is lying to you and tricking you into thinking that the world is worse now than it ever has been. So I'm going to start with the obvious question, which is how can I be so sure that the world is actually getting better and I'm not just living in some kind of naively optimistic mindset? So like I said, when you look at all of the relevant facts, it's very hard to argue that the world isn't actually getting better, such as longevity. The average life expectancy has doubled from only a few generations ago, and that's just scratching the surface. When you look at poverty, only 200 years ago, 85% of the entire world lived in extreme poverty, whereas now, for the first time ever, more people are overweight in the world than underweight. Clearly, the increasing obesity rates isn't a good thing, but it's much better to put things in the hands of the individual rather than being forced to live in a place of poverty. Violent crime has roughly halved over the last 100 years. There are less wars, there's less child mortality due to improved medical practices. Human rights is drastically improved in most parts of the world. And then even when you look at things from a lifestyle and recreational perspective, we now have the ability to travel in an affordable way to almost every part of the world. So why is it then when you look at these statistics that people still feel the world is actually worse now than it ever has been? So I think one of the main reasons is we now live in a world of abundance rather than a world of scarcity. We have too much rather than too little, and we're overstimulated rather than understimulated. Don't forget, we've evolved from hunter-gatherers, and at no point in our long history did we ever need to exercise any kind of restraint, especially when it comes to nutrition or knowledge. Well, that is up until now. Because we've evolved to thrive and survive in situations where we didn't have enough resources, it's now very difficult to deal with situations where we have too much, because our brain, our psychology, our physiology is wired for us to seek out more rather than to seek out less. This is why many physical and mental health issues all boil down to some kind of dopamine hacking. Dopamine is the chemical in our body that makes us want to seek out more, and as we're doing this, we feel good in the process. But when we've consumed enough food or even enough information, we don't want dopamine to go out of control and lead us to want to get more. Obesity happens when we consume too much food, anxiety happens when we consume too much negative stimulation, and addiction happens when we consume too much dopamine producing products. So the only way to fix this is to limit your exposure, and most people think that this has to be done through pure willpower. But in my opinion, this is a bad strategy because willpower is finite, and if you rely too heavily on it, you end up depleting it, and then you end up going back and giving in to your temptations. So it's much better instead to create an environment or change your environment to one that is conducive of the change that you desire. This seems to be one of the important traits that people who end up achieving their goals end up doing. They don't rely on willpower, they just create an environment that helps them get to where they want to go. So for example, if you're trying to give up chocolate, it doesn't make much sense to fill your house with different types of chocolate because then it requires willpower to resist those temptations. Instead, if chocolate is out of the equation, you're going to be less tempted by it, and therefore the environment that you're in is one that will make it less likely for you to go and do the activity you're trying to avoid. So really what it comes down to is making life as easy as possible to do the difficult thing. For example, if you're trying to go to the gym, then make life easy for yourself and have your gym gear ready. Anything that reduces that kind of friction in your life makes it much more likely that you will achieve the goal that you've aimed for. So now I'm going to cover some different areas which makes life more challenging than it needs to, starting with social media. The thing with social media, or even any kind of mainstream media, is that people often have a very binary or black and white way of looking at it. Some people think social media is one of the best inventions, and it's certainly been one of the reasons why we've had a lot of progress in the last few generations. But also some people think it's one of the worst inventions, and it's one of the reasons why there's so much anxiety in the modern world. For me, it depends heavily on what kind of relationship you have with social media and what you make out of it. So for example, if your social media feeds are filled with toxicity, making you feel worse about yourself, or insecure, or anxious, then clearly either you have a negative relationship with social media, or you've created a negative environment with your feeds. So one of the things that I think everyone should do is limit the negativity from their social media. The first way you can do this is by filtering out the mainstream negative news. In my opinion, the news is just a series of channels that's aimed to make other people's problems your problems. But the thing about the mainstream is it's a very wide funnel and it doesn't really apply to you specifically. So what ends up happening is you take responsibility for things that are outside of your control and not tailored to you specifically. Our minds and brains are not built for that kind of stimulation. We're not supposed to feel responsible for things that happen halfway across the world when we had nothing to do with it. It's not to say that we shouldn't have compassion for people in the world who we don't know personally, but we do need to limit either the radius or how often we do this. Otherwise, all that happens is you end up being overwhelmed with all of the problems in the world and you're not able to focus or improve your own life. I think it's useful to remember that throughout most of human history, we lived in tribes. When we reached the agricultural evolution, these tribes became increasingly large, but this is a relatively small percentage of our entire evolutionary history. But throughout most of that history, our tribes rarely exceeded 100 or 150 people. So that leads me to a good tip, which I've applied to my own social media, which is limiting the number of accounts I follow on a particular platform. So excluding accounts that give you some kind of benefit, such as making you feel good, making you laugh, or giving you some kind of helpful knowledge, it's much better to limit your account number to about 100. If, for example, you follow 1,000 different friends or you're following the lives of 1,000 different people, this will become overwhelming to you. And not only that, but you end up comparing your own life to the highlights of other people, which in turn will end up making you feel worse about yourself. A good way of curating your social media is asking yourself when you've consumed a piece of content like a video, how it makes you feel. It's important not to ask yourself this question as you're consuming the content, because if you've clicked on the video and you're still watching it, then something has intrigued you or captured your attention. But immediately following that, you'll be much better placed to ask yourself whether this was something that's made you feel good, made you feel bad, or had some kind of positive benefit on your life. So one piece of advice I came across regarding Twitter is never go above 99 follows. So if there's a particular account that you really want to follow, it means you have to unfollow something that you've already followed in order to create room for that new one. Now I'm going to transition from social media to food and how your dietary decisions have a huge impact on your life. As I mentioned earlier, we now live in a world of abundance rather than scarcity. And for the first time ever, even if you're in a relatively poor economic environment, you still have more food options than you ever would have had in human history. So the problem has shifted from how can I eat to what should I eat and how much of it should I eat. So I think there are a few different ways of approaching this problem, and the first is to track your nutrition or tracking your macros. If you track everything you eat, it can help you keep aligned with how much of each type of food group you should be eating, and this will keep you relatively healthy if you're able to stick with it. If this is too rigorous for you, then I'd suggest at the very least getting used to looking at the ingredients in the back of the foods you eat. And if there's a particular item on those ingredients that you don't recognize, either get into the habit of finding out what it is or avoiding the food entirely. This can help you stick with foods of a more natural origin, because as food engineering becomes more sophisticated, we're ending up eating more types of things that our bodies weren't designed to metabolize. I'm going to use a specific example of a food ingredient to show what happens when we overindulge. The thing I'm talking about is fructose, which is naturally found in fruit, fruit juices, and we find it now a lot in high fructose corn syrup. You may know that our bodies typically get its energy from breaking down different types of food into glucose. Fructose is very similar to glucose, but it's metabolized slightly differently, and this has the effect of making you feel more hungry after eating or ingesting it. This is particularly true when it's in liquid form, so if you're in the habit of drinking a lot of fruit juice, you should be aware that it will make you feel more hungry after drinking it. This also explains why you could be full after having dinner, but there's still room for dessert, because when you eat that dessert, which could have high fructose, it could end up making you feel more hungry, and therefore it feels like you're creating room for it. The reason why this occurs is actually very obvious, because if you're out in the wild as a hunter-gatherer and you come across some kind of fruit like berries, it's in your interest to eat it regardless of how full you are at the time, because these things were not very common and they're seasonal, so you never know when the next time you're going to find it. The other thing which I try to avoid as much as possible is artificial ingredients, such as artificial sweeteners. The evidence around artificial ingredients is a little bit inconclusive at this point in terms of its harmful effects, but there are some emerging studies which are coming out which seem to indicate that they're actually worse than we initially expected. This is what's recently led the World Health Organization to label aspartame potentially carcinogenic. In case you didn't know, aspartame is found in lots of products such as Diet Coke and chewing gum. So if there's a rule of thumb to follow, it's that you should lean towards foods that are naturally occurring rather than things that are synthesized in a lab. If you're able to limit yourself to foods that come directly from plants or animals, your body's much better equipped to be able to metabolize these types of foods and to regulate your hunger levels. The thing I find about life, and that could apply to your diet or social media or anything really, is that things tend to follow either an upward or downward spiral. So if, for example, you make a small positive change to your diet, you will in turn feel better about yourself, which will prompt you to make better decisions about something else, which will then make you feel better about yourself going into the future. This is why small changes compound over time, and if you're able to break the negativity cycle, you're more likely to be able to make more positive changes going forward. So to summarize, create an environment which makes good decision making easier. So I'm going to leave it here for this video, but I hope to make videos on related topics or even approach things from a different angle. So if you have any feedback or you like the video, let me know. Otherwise, I will see you in the next one.